His daughter had been born at 11:47 in the evening. He had been in the room for all of it, 12 hours of labor, and the last 30 minutes that were different from the 12 hours in the way that the final stage of anything you have prepared for is different from the preparation, which is to say, more immediate, more physical, more present in the body, and therefore less available to the thinking mind that prepares and plans. He had been holding Renata's hand, and he had been useful, he thought, in the specific way that the people who prepare carefully for a birth are useful, which is not the way you imagined when you were preparing, because what you imagined was a version of yourself that was calm and steady and said the right things, and what you actually are in the room is a person who has forgotten most of what they prepared, and who is instead completely present in the thing that is happening, which is better than the prepared version in every way that counts. He had thought somewhere in the 4th hour about the bridge assessment he had completed the previous week, a pedestrian bridge on the East Side Greenway that had been flagged by a maintenance crew for an unusual vibration pattern on windy days. He had assessed the bridge and had found a microfracture in one of the anchor plates that was not yet causing structural failure, but that was the kind of thing that became structural failure over 2 to 3 years without intervention. He had written the assessment and recommended remediation. The remediation had been scheduled. The bridge would hold. He had spent 4 hours on that assessment. He had thought about it in the 4th hour of labor in the way that your mind reaches for something familiar when what is happening is too large to be fully comprehended. And he had thought, this is not like the bridge. The bridge was something he could assess from outside. This was something he was inside. The difference between the two was the difference between knowledge and experience. He had thought in the middle of the 12 hours about the fact that this was the 3rd time he had been in this situation, and that the 3rd time was as complete as the first 2. He had expected it to be different, less intense, less present, because he had done it before and knew what to expect. He had been wrong about this. The thing about being in the room for a birth is not that the knowledge of what is happening reduces its intensity. It is that the intensity is native to the event and not reducible by familiarity. He had been fully in it both times before, and he was fully in it now, and the difference was only that now he had the capacity to notice from inside the intensity that the capacity to notice it was a form of gratitude. He had held the baby at 11:52, 5 minutes and some seconds old, 6 pounds 11 ounces. Her eyes were closed and her hands were the specific hands of a newborn. The fingers that seemed too fine and too complete, the nails already formed, the wrinkle lines already present, and he had held her with both hands and he had said, "Hi." He had said it quietly in the voice he had not planned, but that arrived fully formed when he first held her, which was the voice he would use with her for the rest of his life when something mattered most. His name was Theodore James Osei. He was 56 years old. He had been a civil engineer for the county for 29 years, specializing in infrastructure assessment, which was the work of looking at the things people build and evaluating whether they will hold the bridges, the retaining walls, the drainage systems, the load-bearing structures that cities put in place and then depend on for decades. He had a particular talent for seeing what was wrong before it became visibly wrong, which was the most valuable thing in infrastructure work and the thing that was hardest to teach and easiest to take for granted when it was present. He had a reputation among his colleagues for being right about things that had not yet failed. His supervisor, a woman named Diane Ostrowski, who had been running the infrastructure division for 14 years, had said about him at his 25th year review. Theodore identifies failure points in systems that look fine to everyone else, and then writes assessments that are specific enough to be acted on without additional interpretation. This is the rarest combination in this work. She had meant it as a compliment. Theodore had understood it as an accurate description. He had a particular way of completing the assessments. He wrote them in a plain, direct prose that moved from observation to implication to recommended action without intermediary steps that would allow the reader to lose the thread between what was happening and why it mattered and what should be done. He had developed this style over 29 years by watching what happened when assessments were written in a different style. The assessments that were technically accurate, but that buried the actionable finding in qualification and context. The assessments that described the problem without describing the consequence. The assessments that were right, but that did not produce action because the person who read them did not fully understand what they were being asked to do. He had learned to write assessments that could not be misread. He had applied this principle to every formal document he wrote, which was why the complaint cover note had been what it was. He had been married to Renata for 28 years. They had met at a university function when she was in her second year of medical school, and he was finishing his graduate degree in civil engineering. And they had from the first conversation understood each other in the specific way of people who have found someone who thinks the way they think about the things they think about most. She had said on that first evening that medicine was the engineering of systems that fail without warning, and that the interesting problem was always the same. How do you see the failure before it happens? He had said, that is also what I do. She had looked at him and said, then we should keep talking. They had kept talking for 28 years. She was a general practitioner now, with a practice on the east side that she had run for 19 years. The practice had started with 3 exam rooms and a single administrative assistant named Margaret, who had been with Renata since the first year, and who still managed the front office with the specific competence of someone who knows every patient's name and which of them need a reminder call and which of them would find a reminder call intrusive. The practice had grown to 6 rooms and 4 physicians, but Renata still saw her original patients, the ones who had been with her for 19 years, the ones who had children who were now bringing their own children to the practice, the ones who had said when her partners joined, we're glad the practice is growing, but we're here to see Dr. Osei. She understood this as the highest form of professional recognition, which it was. Their son James was 24 and worked in finance in another city, and called every Sunday without fail, which was a habit that had started when he left for university, and that had continued through 4 years of university and 3 years of work, because he was the kind of person who maintained the commitments he had made to the people who mattered to him, without needing to be reminded that they mattered. Their daughter Adaeze was 21, and in her 3rd year of university studying biochemistry, which she had chosen because she had grown up watching her mother's work and had understood from age 14 that the chemistry of living things was both more complex and more interesting than the chemistry of non-living things, and that understanding this required a level of rigor that she was built for. The baby, the new baby, the unexpected baby, the baby that had arrived as a surprise in the specific way that the things you have stopped expecting sometimes arrive, was the 3rd child, and she had arrived into a house that was ready for her in all the ways that a house is ready when the people in it have been parents for 24 years and know what it requires. Theodore had said when Renata told him in November, 7 months before the delivery well. He had sat with it for a moment. He had said, I thought I was done. She had looked at him. He had said I was wrong. He had said it clearly, and with the specific warmth of a man who understands the difference between what he expected and what he wants, and who has learned in 28 years of marriage that these 2 things are not always the same. She had said so did I. He had said so we were both wrong. She had said yes. He had looked at her. He had said, I'm glad we were wrong. She had said yes. She had said me too. Her name was Imani. They had chosen it months before she arrived in the conversation that had lasted 3 evenings and that had ranged across the names that mattered to both of them. Names from his family's history and from Renata's names that carried meaning in both their languages. Names that felt like promises. The conversation was one he had valued in the specific way he valued the conversations between him and Renata that had no agenda other than the thing they were trying to decide, where the talking itself was the work. And the talking produced the answer rather than being the announcement of an answer already determined. Imani had felt right from the first evening. He had said it, and Renata had been quiet for a moment and had said yes. That one. And it had been settled. He had also spent those months preparing in the way he prepared for things that required preparation, which was methodically with checklists with the specific documents organized in the specific order they would need to be in. He had the hospital's pre-admission paperwork completed and filed. He had the car seat installed and verified by the county's car seat inspection program 3 months before the due date, because he understood that doing this at the last minute was a source of anxiety that could be eliminated. He had the bag packed for the hospital stay with both his and Renata's items organized in the specific way that Renata would recognize from having agreed on the organization. He had the folder with the insurance documents and the hospital's patient information forms and the family contact list, which contained his mother's number in a crow, and James's number and Adaeze's number and Renata's sister's number and the numbers of 3 people from Renata's practice who had said to call at any hour. He had prepared in the way of someone who knows that the event itself will require all available attention and who therefore eliminates in advance every procedural element that would otherwise compete with that attention. The hospital was Crestwood Medical Center. Renata had delivered there had privileges there and had arranged well in advance for the nursing team and the attending OB she trusted. The delivery had gone as planned except for the ways it had not gone as planned, which were the ways deliveries always do not go as planned, and which the nursing team handled with the competence of people who have been doing this for years and who understood that the plan was a preparation and not a script. His mother had called from Accra 3 minutes after the birth. He had sent a photograph, the first photograph, the one taken by the nurse at 11:53 when Imani was 6 minutes old, and his mother had said when she called, she has the Osei forehead. He had said, Mama, she is 6 minutes old. His mother had said, I know what I see. She said, Theodore. He said, yes. She said, you have done it again. He said, I know. She said, I am coming in April. He said, we will have a room ready. She said, I know you will. She said, you always have a room ready. He thought about his mother after he hung up. She had been a midwife in Accra for 31 years and had delivered more children than he could estimate, and had never in 31 years lost a mother. She had told him once that the reason was not luck and not skill alone, but attention. The specific quality of attention to the signs that told you what was coming before it arrived, which was the same attention he applied to infrastructure, and which he had now concluded was simply the quality his family produced in people who did important work carefully for a long time. The first night, the nursing staff handled most of what needed to be handled. Theodore sat in the chair beside the hospital bed where Renata was sleeping. She had fallen asleep 40 minutes after the delivery, which he understood as the specific collapse of a body that has been sustaining a 12-hour effort, and that once the effort is over, does not negotiate with exhaustion. And he held Imani and looked at her. He was aware of being awake at 2 a.m. in a hospital room with a person who had been in the world for 2 hours. He was aware of the particular quality of attention that this produced, which was different from any other quality of attention he had ever had, including the attentions he had given to James and Adaeze on their first nights. Because even if you have done it before, the specific person being new means the specific attention is new. He thought, I have been a father for 24 years, and I am starting again. He thought, this is the specific thing I would not have expected and that I am most glad about. He placed her in the bassinet at 3 a.m. He looked at the bracelet on her ankle, the pink and blue band with the ID strip, the band that matched his own wristband in the way the nursing staff had explained when they issued both the codes match, they said. Your bracelet and her bracelet are a pair. If anyone in the unit scans them, the system shows a match. He had looked at the two bands and understood the logic of it immediately, the kind of institutional security that works because it is simple and because the simplicity is the strength. He had adjusted the angle of the bracelet on his wrist slightly to make it more visible. He slept in the chair. James called from his city at 6 in the morning, 2 hours after Imani was born, when Theodore texted him the news and the photograph. He said, "Dad." Theodore said yes. He said she's here. Theodore said she's here. He said she has Mama's eyes. Theodore said she has 4 hours of eyes. James said, "I know. I can see them." He said, "Are you okay?" Theodore said, "I'm fine." He said, "I'm better than fine." James said, "I know you are." He said, "I can hear it." He said, "I'll be there Sunday." Theodore said, "We'll be home Sunday." James said, "I know. I'll be there." Adaeze called from her university dormitory an hour later. She had been awake. She had been awake since the text, she said, because the text had arrived at 4:30 in the morning. And once she read it, she was not going to sleep again. She said, "I knew it. I knew she was going to be at night." Theodore said she had her own timing. Adaeze said, "Of course she did." She said, "She is a girl after my heart." She said, "I am coming home Thursday." Theodore said, "The house will be ready." Adaeze said, "Dad, I know the house will be ready." She said, "You had the car seat in 3 months ago." Theodore said, "Correct." Adaeze laughed. She said, "I love you." He said, "I love you too." She said, "Tell Mama she did great." He said, "I will." He said she already knows. The difficulty began on the second morning. His name was Ryan Callister. He was 29. He had been a nursery security technician at Crestwood Medical Center for 14 months, which was a role he had taken after 2 years in retail security that had not been satisfying in the ways he had hoped, and that had provided him with a set of habits and assumptions that were suited to retail security, the environment of ambient suspicion, the assessment of customers for potential theft, the understanding that your role was to prevent wrongdoing by people who were presumed to be potential wrongdoers until they demonstrated otherwise, and that were not well calibrated for the hospital nursery, where the parents and family members present were not potential threats to be assessed, but people in one of the most vulnerable and consequential moments of their lives who required the opposite of ambient suspicion, the assumption of belonging. He had not been taught this distinction clearly in his 14 months at Crestwood. The training for the role had covered the security procedures, the bracelet matching process, the scanner operation, the access protocols, the reporting chain for discrepancies, and had not covered the question of how to approach a family member in a way that was responsive to the difference between a hospital nursery and a retail environment. He had not noticed this gap in the training because the habits from retail security filled it without his awareness. The approach, the challenge, the request for verification, the body language of assessment that retail security produces in its practitioners and that parents holding their newborn children experience as exactly what it is. The training also had not covered what to do when the scanner returned an unexpected result. The procedure, as written, said, in the event of a bracelet mismatch indication, the security technician should initiate a verification process. The procedure did not specify that the first step of the verification process was to confirm that the scanner itself was set up correctly for the current patient. This gap was an error in the procedure and not in the security technician's understanding of the procedure. Though the security technician's decision to sustain the challenge without checking the scanner setup was a decision that a more experienced technician in a patient care environment rather than a retail environment would not have made. The procedure was part of the failure. The training was part of the failure. The failure had a history of 14 months in which it had occurred twice before and had not been examined as a failure because the 2 prior occurrences had not been read together and the training had not been updated after the first. The position existed because hospital nurseries have security procedures. Bracelet matching the electronic ankle monitoring on each infant, The access protocols for the nursery unit and the security technician's role was to assist with these procedures and to monitor the nursery area. The procedures correctly applied were straightforward and useful. The bracelet system was reliable. Discrepancies in the system were rare and were almost always the result of scanner setup error rather than identity mismatch. The correct response to an apparent discrepancy was to check the scanner setup before challenging the parent. He had in those 14 months received 2 informal internal complaints. The first was from a man named Gerald Okafor, 38, who had said that Callister approached him in the nursery, questioned his identity and right to be present, and asked him to return his son to the bassinet, despite the fact that Gerald was wearing a matching bracelet and a current visitor badge and had been confirmed by the nursing staff 30 minutes earlier. Gerald had filed the complaint through the hospital's patient feedback portal and had noted in the complaint that his wife was white and that she had not been approached in the nursery during the same visit. The second complaint was from a woman named Evelyn Patterson, 63, grandmother of a child in the nursery, who had said that Callister had followed her through the unit's corridor for 4 minutes while she walked from the nursing desk to her daughter's room. Despite her visitor badge being clearly displayed and the nursing staff having confirmed her presence on the floor. She had said in her complaint that she had felt surveilled and that the surveillance had continued after she showed the badge a second time and after a nurse had waved to her from the hallway. Both complaints had been logged in the human resources system, and neither had resulted in formal review or counseling. The human resources intake process at Crestwood logged complaints individually by department and staff member, but did not flag individual files for sequential review until a third complaint was received. Neither of the 2 prior complaints had been read alongside the other. A pattern that requires reading 2 documents together had not been read in 14 months. Theodore had been in the nursery at 7:40 in the morning with Imani in his arms when Callister approached. It had been a good morning up to that point. He had arrived at the hospital at 6:55 when visiting hours began, having slept at home for 5 hours. Renata had told him to go home and sleep before the second day, which she had said with the specific authority of a physician who knows what sleep deprivation does and who will not allow the people she loves to be impaired by it unnecessarily. He had arrived to find Renata awake and fed and holding Imani, and Imani had the look of a person who has decided that the new arrangements are acceptable. He had kissed Renata. He had taken Imani and walked with her down the hall to the nursery where the nursing staff were doing their morning assessments of the infants in the unit. He had been in the nursery for 20 minutes. He had spoken with 2 nurses, a woman named Carla, who had been on the floor for 7 years and who had told him Imani's overnight numbers were good, and a man named Tony who had weighed Imani that morning and confirmed she was within the expected range. The charge nurse, Linda Vasquez, had come by at 7:30 when she started her shift and had confirmed both his visitor bracelet and his badge as part of her morning protocol. She had looked at the bracelet, scanned it against her own tablet, noted the match, and said, "Good morning, Mr. Osei. Imani looks well." He had said she does. He had said thank you for the confirmation. She had said standard procedure. She had said it in the way that things become standard procedure because they are done every time by everyone, without exception. The confirmation had taken 45 seconds. It had been the verification that was supposed to happen. It had happened correctly. 37 minutes later, in the same nursery, a different verification had been run by a different person using a device that had not been set up correctly for the scan, and had produced a result that was not a discrepancy in the bracelet system, but a discrepancy in the scanner setup, a distinction that the correct procedure required be determined before any other action was taken, and that had not been determined. Theodore was wearing the visitor identification band on his right wrist, the band that the nursing staff had placed on him at the time of Imani's birth at 11:52 the previous night, and that matched Imani's ankle bracelet in the specific coding that the nursery's security system used. The band was pink and blue, The hospital's maternity unit coloring and the ID strip contained the coding that matched it uniquely to Imani's ankle bracelet. He also had the visitor badge that the nursing desk had issued when he arrived that morning, a plastic card in a lanyard holder with his name. His photograph and the words family/authorized printed in green. Both were clearly visible. The bracelet was on his wrist. The badge was around his neck. Callister approached from the right side of the nursery where the monitoring station was. He had a scanner in his hand. He said, "Sir, I need to verify your identification." Theodore looked at him. He was familiar with the verification procedure. The nursing staff had explained it at admission, and the logic of the matching bracelet system was clear to him. He said, "I am wearing the matching bracelet." He raised his right wrist to show the band clearly. He said, "And I have the visitor badge from the nursing desk." He indicated the lanyard. Callister said, "I understand that, sir." He said, "I need to verify that the bracelet matches this specific infant." He said it with the manner of someone who is performing a function he is entitled to perform, which he was in principle. The bracelet verification was a legitimate procedure. He held up the scanner. He scanned Imani's ankle bracelet first. He looked at the screen. He scanned Theodore's wristband. He looked at the screen again. He said, "There's a discrepancy in the system." Theodore said, "What is the discrepancy?" He said it in the precise, patient voice he used when he was working through a technical problem, the voice of a man who has spent 29 years identifying discrepancies in complex systems, and who understands that the first step is always to describe the discrepancy precisely. He said, "What is the system showing for her bracelet?" He said, "And what is it showing for mine?" Callister said, "Sir, there is a mismatch indicated. I need to ask you to return the infant to the bassinet while we complete the verification." Theodore said, "I am not going to return her to the bassinet on the basis of a system indication that you haven't explained to me." He said it without raising his voice. He said, "I am her father." His name was on the band. His bracelet was issued by the nursing staff at the time of her birth. He said, "My wife is Dr. Renata Osei, and she is a patient in room 414. He said, before I do anything you are asking me to do, I would like you to tell me what the system is showing specifically." Callister said, "I can't discuss the specifics of the security system with you, sir. It is a confidential procedure." He said, "I need you to cooperate by returning the infant to the bassinet." He said it with the specific firmness of someone who has been told in his training that the security procedure is the authority and that the procedure is followed without negotiation. Theodore looked at him. He held Imani against his left shoulder, his right hand on her back. He said, "I have been a county civil engineer for 29 years. He said, in 29 years, I have never been told that a security check cannot be explained to the person being checked. He said, if there is a discrepancy in the system, I want to understand the discrepancy. If the discrepancy is a scanner error, I want that established before any other step is taken." He said, "I am not going to return my daughter to the bassinet until I understand what you believe the problem is." The word daughter had a specific weight in the sentence. Theodore had said it without emphasis as a statement of fact, the way you say a word when the word is simply the correct word for the relationship you are describing. It had been in the world for approximately 16 hours. Callister said, "Sir, I am going to ask you one more time to cooperate with the security procedure." Theodore said, "I would like the charge nurse to be here for this conversation." He said it directly. He said, "Please call the charge nurse." Callister said, "I'm going to need to escalate this if you don't cooperate." He was already reaching for the radio at his belt. Theodore said, "Please do. I am specifically asking you to escalate this to the charge nurse." He said, "I will wait here." The charge nurse was Linda Vasquez. She had been the charge nurse on the maternity floor at Crestwood Medical Center for 11 years. In 11 years, she had managed the full range of situations that a maternity floor produces. The medical complications, the family dynamics, the equipment, failures, the staffing challenges, the patient concerns that ranged from procedural questions to genuine distress. and she had developed in those 11 years the specific competence of a charge nurse who knows what is happening on her floor at any given moment without needing to be told. She knew who the patients were, and who their families were, and what their status was. She had met Theodore at 7:30 when she started her shift and completed her morning walkthrough of the unit, and she had confirmed his bracelet and his badge as part of the standard check she performed on all family members present in the unit during her walkthrough. She had said good morning. He had said good morning. She had noted father present verified Imani Osei room 414. She arrived in the nursery in 45 seconds. The 45 seconds was not slow and not fast. It was the speed of a person who understands that the situation has a quality that requires prompt attention without requiring the appearance of emergency. Because the appearance of emergency on a maternity floor creates a different quality of alarm than the situation warrants. She moved through the nursery doors and looked immediately at Theodore because the nursing staff had said the father was in there, and she had the specific orientation toward parents of new infants that 11 years had produced in her, which was the parent is the center of what is happening. Everything else is context. Theodore was standing in the middle of the nursery with Imani against his left shoulder and his right hand on her back, and his expression in the specific composure of a man who is very controlled and who is very unhappy, and who has decided that the most useful thing he can do in this moment is be controlled. Callister was standing in front of him with the scanner in his hand. She said, "What is the issue here?" She said it to both of them, but she was looking at the scanner because the scanner was the relevant physical object. Callister said, "There is a discrepancy in the bracelet matching system." He held up the scanner. She took it from him and looked at it. She looked at Theodore's bracelet. She looked at the scanner again. She looked at the patient profile that was loaded on the scanner's interface. She said, "The wrong infant profile is loaded on this scanner." She said it without softening and without amplification because it was a fact, and the fact was the relevant thing. She said, "You are scanning against a different infant's record." She said, "This is a scanner setup error." She made 2 adjustments to the scanner interface. She rescanned Imani's ankle bracelet. She rescanned Theodore's wristband. The scanner returned, match confirmed. She held the scanner so that Theodore could see the screen. She said, "Match confirmed." She said, "As it has been since 11:52 last night." She looked at Callister. She said, "In the future, when a scan returns a discrepancy, the first step is to verify the scanner setup before approaching the family member." She said it in the same flat, informational voice she used for everything on the floor, because the informational voice was the voice that was heard, and this was something that needed to be heard. She said, "That is the procedure." She said, "We will discuss this further after your shift." Callister said to Theodore, "I apologize, sir." He said it with the specific quality of an apology that is aware of its own inadequacy. Theodore looked at him for a moment. He said, "I appreciate the apology." He said it without performance and without sarcasm, because he was not interested in either, and because sarcasm in a hospital nursery with a newborn against his shoulder was not where he wanted his energy to go. He said, "I want to understand how the wrong patient profile came to be loaded on the scanner, and I want to know what procedure is in place to prevent this from happening to the next parent who is in this room with their child." Linda Vasquez said, "That is a legitimate question, and I will have an answer for you." She said, "Theodore, I apologize to you for what happened on this floor this morning." She said it directly and without qualification, because a charge nurse who qualifies an apology to a parent who was asked to surrender his newborn on the basis of an unchecked scanner error is not giving an apology but a legal statement, and she was not in the business of legal statements. She said, "This is not what this floor is supposed to be for its patients and families." He said, "I know it is not." He said, "I am not angry at this floor." He said, "I am angry at the specific thing that happened, and I would like it to not happen to the next person." He held Imani against his shoulder. He said, "I am going to go back to Renata now." He said, "I will have more to say later." He turned and walked back toward room 414, Imani against his shoulder, his hand on her back, his footsteps steady in the corridor. He told Renata what had happened when he returned to room 414. He told it to her in the specific way he told difficult things in order without editing, because Renata was a physician and a person who had been married to him for 28 years, and who needed the account to be accurate rather than curated. She listened. She did not interrupt. She was sitting in the hospital bed with the specific composed expression of a doctor who is also a patient, who is also a wife, who is also a mother, who is being told that something unacceptable happened to her husband in the nursery while she was sleeping. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She said the wrong profile was loaded on the scanner. He said yes. She said he scanned against the wrong record. He said yes. She said, and he did not check the scanner setup before approaching you. He said correct. She said. And he asked you to return Imani to the bassinet before he had checked whether his own scanner was functioning correctly. He said yes. She said, I want to know about his prior record. He said, so do I. He said, that is part of what I am going to find out this afternoon. She said, I'm going to speak to the chief of staff. He said I would ask you to let me handle the formal complaint first. She looked at him. He said I want it in the record in my name. She understood this. She said, all right. She said, but I am going to be in that conversation eventually. He said, I know. He said, that's fine. He picked up Imani from the bassinet beside the bed. He said, she's fine. She said, I know she is. She said, that's not why I'm upset. He said, I know. The complaint he filed that afternoon was formal and specific. He had asked for the complaint form from the hospital's patient relations office, and he had completed it at the small table in room 414, while Renata held Imani and the afternoon sun came through the window at the angle it came through in late summer. He completed the form in the specific way he completed formal documents, precisely in the order of events with the relevant details, the time of the approach 7:40 a.m., the nature of the claim discrepancy in the bracelet matching system, the request to return the infant to the bassinet, the request for explanation of the specific discrepancy which was declined, the arrival of the charge nurse, the identification of the scanner setup error, wrong patient profile loaded, the confirmation of match. He submitted it that afternoon with a cover note that was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph described the incident. The second paragraph described his professional background as a civil engineer who had spent 29 years identifying failure points in complex systems, and noted that the failure point here was not the scanner which was functioning correctly, but the procedure for confirming scanner setup before initiating a challenge to a parent, and that this failure point would produce the same outcome in future incidents unless the procedure was changed. The third paragraph said, I am requesting that this incident be reviewed alongside any prior similar incidents in Mr. Callister's file. A pattern of conduct of this nature is only visible when the individual incidents are read in sequence rather than as isolated events. I am asking you to read them in sequence. I do not require an individual response to this complaint. I require that the sequence be read. He submitted the complaint and the cover note at 4:15 in the afternoon. He put a copy in the folder he had with him, which he carried because he carried folders when he was going to hospitals or government offices or anywhere that documentation might matter, which was the habit of a man who had spent 29 years understanding the value of having the record on his own person. The patient relations director was a woman named Margaret Holloway, who had been in the role for 8 years and who had the specific quality of a patient relations director who takes the work seriously enough to understand that the formal complaint process is only useful if someone reads the complaints. She had read Theodore's cover note and had read it a second time slowly because the third paragraph had said something that she recognized as important. Read them in sequence. She had gone to the human resources system. She had pulled Callister's file. She had found the 2 prior informal complaints, Gerald Okafor's and Evelyn Patterson's, and she had read all 3 together. The reading had taken 15 minutes. The pattern in the 3 complaints was specific. In the first complaint, a black man had been questioned about his right to be in the nursery despite a matching bracelet and a current visitor badge. In the second complaint, a black woman had been followed through the corridor of the maternity unit, despite displaying her visitor badge clearly, and had continued to be followed after showing it a second time, and after a nurse confirmed her presence. In the third complaint, a black man had been asked to surrender his newborn to the bassinet on the basis of a scanner discrepancy that, when the charge nurse arrived and examined the scanner, turned out to be a setup error. The wrong patient profile had been loaded on the device. In all 3 instances, the person challenged had valid documentation. In all 3 instances, the challenge was sustained beyond the point at which the documentation was visible. In all 3 instances, the scanner or the system had been offered as the explanation. She wrote in her assessment, the 3 incidents read as a sequence describe a pattern of conduct that cannot be attributed to system error or procedural misunderstanding alone. System errors are random. A sequence in which the same type of person is challenged in the same ways across 3 incidents separated by months is not random. This pattern requires formal review. Formal. She escalated to the hospital's compliance officer that afternoon. She also called Theodore Osei and left a message that she composed carefully because the message needed to say something real in the specific constraints of a phone message. She said, "This is Margaret Holloway, Patient Relations Director at Crestwood Medical Center. I am calling regarding your complaint filed today. I have reviewed your complaint and the prior complaints in the relevant file. We have identified a pattern of conduct that requires action. We will be in contact within 5 business days with an account of what actions are being taken. I want to thank you specifically for the request in your cover note." Reading the complaints in sequence was what made the pattern visible. We would not have seen it without doing that. Theodore received the message on the 3rd day, when Renata and Imani were home. They had arrived home from the hospital the previous afternoon, and the house had the specific quality of a house in which a new person has just arrived. The particular fullness of a space that is adjusting to a presence it did not previously contain. The way furniture that has been in the same positions for years seems to have shifted slightly. The way sounds are different when there is a 3rd person breathing in the rooms. His mother had called from Accra when they arrived home and had said put her near a window with good light. Renata had said in the background, "We know Mama." His mother had said, "I know you know. I am saying it anyway." He had said she is near a window. His mother had said, "Good." She said, "How are you?" He had said, "I am fine." He had said something happened at the hospital. He had told her. She had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "And then you filed the complaint." He said, "Yes." She said, "Of course you did." She said, "Theodore, I have been watching you describe failure points to people who had not noticed them for 29 years. She said, "This is what you do." He had said, "Yes, Mama." She had said, "And they listened." He said, "They read the complaints in sequence." She said, "Good." She said, "That is all you asked them to do." He listened to Margaret Holloway's voicemail on the 3rd morning in the kitchen while Imani slept in the bassinet in the dining room, and Renata was at her desk reviewing patient files she had taken 2 weeks off, but was doing a minimal amount of reading to stay current because 2 weeks away from a medical practice produces specific gaps that Renata preferred to manage in advance. He listened to the message once and then a second time to be sure of what he had heard, and then he called back. The compliance officer was a man named David Park. He had been in the role for 6 years, and he had the specific directness of someone who has spent 6 years having difficult conversations about institutional failures, and who has learned that directness is kinder than ambiguity in these conversations. He said, "Mr. Osei," he said, "I want to tell you specifically what we have found and what we are doing." He said, "We reviewed the prior complaints in Mr. Callister's file after reading your cover note, which requested that we do so. We found 2 prior informal complaints that had not been read together. When we read all 3 complaints together, the pattern was clear. He described the pattern in the same terms Theodore had anticipated: the consistent targeting of black family members with valid documentation, the sustained challenge beyond the point at which documentation had been presented, the system error framing. He said Mr. Callister has been placed on administrative suspension pending formal disciplinary review. He said we have updated the bracelet verification procedure to require a charge nurse co-signature before any parent is asked to surrender an infant on the basis of a discrepancy claim. The co-signature requirement means that the scanner setup is verified by a nurse before the challenge is sustained. He said we have implemented a protocol requiring sequential review of a staff member's complaint file. When a second complaint is received, the protocol triggers a review of all prior complaints together. At the time, the second complaint is logged rather than waiting for a third. Theodore listened. He said the co-signature requirement is the correct change. He said it removes the single point of failure that produced this incident, which was an unchecked assumption treated as established fact. He said it as a structural observation, which was what it was. The compliance officer said yes. That is how we described it in the internal assessment as well. Theodore said the sequential review protocol at the second complaint, rather than the third, that is also the correct change. He said a pattern between 2 complaints is visible if you look for it. 3 complaints means the pattern has already been established. The compliance officer said that is in your cover note as well. Theodore said I wrote what I observed. The compliance officer said your cover note was specific in a way that was directly useful. Theodore said I have spent 29 years identifying failure points. When I see one, I describe it. The compliance officer said, it made the difference here. Theodore said I know. I expected it would. Gerald Okafor was contacted by the hospital's patient relations office. He was told that his prior complaint had been part of a pattern finding that action had been taken and that the hospital was implementing procedural changes. He said I wasn't sure the first complaint was going to go anywhere. I filed it because I wanted it on record, not because I expected results. The patient relations coordinator said it was on record. When a third complaint arrived with a specific request to read the complaints together, your complaint was the first one in the sequence. He said who made the request. She said a father who filed a complaint on the same day his daughter was born. Gerald said he had a newborn in his arms. She said yes. Gerald was quiet. He said, I'm glad he filed it. She said, so are we. Evelyn Patterson was contacted through her daughter, who answered the phone. The daughter said, my mother is out, but I can take the message. The coordinator gave her the summary. The daughter said, my mother moved to the secondary corridor because she didn't know she didn't have to. She said she never said anything about it to anyone except me. The coordinator said her complaint is what made the pattern complete when we read it. The daughter said 3 complaints. She said, and nobody read them together until the third one came in with a note that asked for it. The coordinator said that is correct. The daughter said my mother didn't sleep well for a week after that. She felt like she had done something wrong. The coordinator said she had not done anything wrong. The daughter said I know that, but she didn't, not at the time. Not at the end. The coordinator made a note of this in her file. She wrote the prior complainant's daughter noted that her mother did not know she had the option to refuse the move to the secondary area. This suggests the impact extended beyond the specific incident into a period of self-doubt that the complainant should not have experienced. This is relevant to assessing the full scope of harm. She submitted the note to the patient relations director. Margaret Holloway read it and added it to the case file. She added a line to the new protocol that said, when a challenge to a family member's authorization is initiated, the family member must be told clearly that they have the right to remain in their current location while the challenge is being verified. The right to remain is not contingent on resolution of the challenge. Evelyn Patterson, who had moved from the family greeting area because she had not known she did not have to, had not moved because she wanted to. The protocol was a recognition that the institution's obligation was to make that clear. He went back to the kitchen. Imani was still asleep in the bassinet. He looked at her for a moment, the specific face of a person who has been in the world for 3 days and who is sleeping with the complete investment of a person who has not yet learned to sleep with any reservation. He thought about the bracelet on her ankle, the matching band on his wrist, the charge nurse who had arrived in 45 seconds and looked at the scanner and said, "The wrong profile is loaded." He thought about the 15 minutes it had taken the patient relations director to see the pattern that 14 months of individual complaints had not seen. He thought about the co-signature requirement and the next father who would be holding a child in that nursery. He told Renata about the call when she came into the kitchen for coffee. She listened, as she always did, to the full account before she said anything. When he finished, she said the co-signature requirement is the right change. He said yes. She said because it removes the single point of failure. He said correct. She said which was one person's unchecked assumption being treated as established fact. He said yes. She said, "I want to read the cover note you submitted." He handed her the copy from the folder. She read it standing at the counter with her coffee in her other hand. She read it slowly, the way she read things that mattered. When she finished, she put it on the counter. She said, "You described it precisely." He said, "I know what to describe." She said, "I know you do." She said, "Theodore." He said, "Yes." She said they might not have read the prior complaints without the cover note. He said, "I know. That was why I wrote it." She said, "Yes." She said, "That is what you do." He had understood the cover note from the moment he decided to write it as the same kind of document he wrote for the county when he identified a structural failure point that had not yet produced a visible failure. The document that says, "This is the problem, and this is why it is a problem, and this is what will happen if it is not addressed." The document that is specific because specificity is what separates a useful assessment from an observation. He had written it the way he would write any technical document in order in plain language, with the relevant detail and the requested action clearly stated. He had not expected anything less than what had happened, which was that the person who received it had read it and done what it asked. This was what the work of assessment was for. Not to describe what had already failed, but to describe what would fail if the failure point was not addressed. The bracelet had always matched. The charge nurse had confirmed it in 45 seconds on the morning of the second day. The complaint and the cover note had produced a change in the procedure. The next father who stood in that nursery with a matching bracelet and a visitor badge and a discrepancy claim would have the charge nurse's co-signature as the requirement before being asked to do anything. The failure point had been described. The structure had been changed. He was a civil engineer. His work was the assessment of structures, the examination of what holds and what is at risk of failing, and what needs to be changed before the failure becomes visible to everyone. He had spent 29 years doing this work in the county's infrastructure. He understood the same work in a different material. The structures that hold people are made of procedures and records, and the people who are responsible for reading those records in sequence. A structure that is maintained correctly holds. A structure that is not examined fails in a way that could have been prevented. The point of the assessment is not to document the failure. It is to prevent the failure before it occurs. He picked up Imani. She stirred and did not wake. He walked to the window. Outside, the east side of the city was going about its morning. The school buses, the delivery trucks, the neighbors he had lived beside for 28 years. He held his daughter, and he looked at the street, and he thought about Gerald Okafor and Evelyn Patterson, and the complaints that had been in the system for 14 months, filed and logged and not read together. He thought about the 15 minutes. He thought about the co-signature. He thought the bracelet matched. It always matched. And now the next time someone says it doesn't, the charge nurse signs it first. Renata came to stand beside him. She did not take Imani. She let him hold her because she understood that he needed to hold her the way you need to hold a thing you were told to put down and that you did not put down. She put her hand on his arm. He looked at her. He said she is fine. She said, I know. She said, and it will be different for the next person. He said yes. He said, that is what it was for. She said, I know. She put her head against his shoulder. They stood at the window with Imani between them and the east side morning going past outside, and the bracelet on Imani's ankle matched the band on Theodore's wrist, the way it had matched since 11:52 on the night she was born, and it would continue to match as it always had, and the next person in that nursery would not be asked to prove it without the charge nurse there to confirm. Linda Vasquez, the charge nurse, submitted her own incident report to the hospital's nursing supervisor following the incident. Her report was 1 page, and it described what she had observed when she arrived in the nursery. The scanner setup error. The wrong patient profile loaded the match, confirmed on the corrected scan. She added a recommendation at the bottom of the report that said the procedure for handling bracelet discrepancy claims should be updated to require nursing staff confirmation of scanner setup before family members are asked to take any action. This is a simple change that would prevent this type of incident from recurring. She signed it. She submitted it. The recommendation was incorporated into the updated procedure that the compliance officer implemented following the complaint review. Linda Vasquez had not known about the cover note or the complaint. She had arrived at the same recommendation independently from the same evidence from a different direction. This was what it looked like when people who did the work correctly also thought about the work correctly. They saw the same failure points because the failure points were real, and they described them because describing them was the appropriate response to seeing them. The compliance officer followed up in writing as promised within 5 business days of the initial call. The written communication was 2 pages and described each of the 4 procedural changes in specific terms, including the timeline for implementation and the name of the person responsible for each change. Theodore read the 2 pages at his desk in the study, the same desk where he wrote infrastructure assessments, and he found it to be what a formal response to a formally submitted complaint should be: specific, actionable, and responsive to what had been asked. The compliance review was completed within 5 business days as promised. Callister's formal disciplinary review resulted in termination of his employment at Crestwood Medical Center. The findings stated that the pattern of conduct identified in the 3 complaints read together constituted a violation of the hospital's non-discrimination policy and its patient and family rights policy, and that the violations were not isolated incidents, but a pattern of conduct that had continued despite 2 prior informal complaints being on record. The finding also noted that the prior complaints had not triggered a formal review, because the hospital's prior policy had not required sequential review of a staff member's file until a 3rd complaint was received. The policy had been updated. The threshold was now 2 complaints. Theodore Osei filed his complaint on the afternoon of the day his daughter was born. He wrote a cover note that asked for a specific thing. The specific thing was done. Gerald Okafor and Evelyn Patterson, who had filed their own complaints 14 months before this one, were contacted and told that the pattern had been found. Margaret Holloway said of Theodore's cover note, it was specific in a way that was directly useful. David Park said it made the difference. Theodore had said, I know what to describe. He had spent 29 years learning to describe what was wrong before it failed visibly in language that was specific enough to be acted on for institutions that were capable of acting when they understood what was asked. He described it clearly and specifically. They acted on what was described. The structure was changed. The co-signature requirement. The sequential review threshold at 2 complaints. the right to remain language. The scanner, verification step, 4 changes, each specific, closing a failure point that had been open for 14 months, and that had produced 2 incidents before this one, and that would have produced more after. A structure that has been correctly changed holds in ways that the unchanged structure never did and never would have. That was the work. That was what it was for. That was enough. That was the particular and lasting kind of enough. 29 years of describing failure points before they became visible failures in language specific enough to be acted on without additional interpretation. 1 complaint, 1 cover note, 1 request to read the complaints in sequence. The structure was changed specifically for the next person who came through the nursery door with a matching bracelet on their wrist and a child in their arms, and the right to be where they were. Subscribe our channel. We follow the fathers who identify the failure point and describe it specifically so it can be fixed. Like this video if it moved you at all. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. Comment your thoughts or similar experiences.